Recently, I was perusing a broad selection of trailers of modern Western entertainment, and I found myself once again pondering, why is there an insistence upon gray morality in every single project? Did Hollywood just up and forget how engaging and fun a completely morally bankrupt villain can be? And being an absolute scud goblin doesn't mean that the villain isn't smart or that his motivations don't make sense. Alan Rickman in Die Hard comes to mind, who despite being an irredeemable reprobate, is still an excellent villain with completely logical motivations. Another example of this is Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, who is also an individual with believable motivations, despite the sheer insanity of said character. There is a difference between a compelling villain whose motivations are somewhat logical and the villains of Le Current Year. Let's start with the impetus for this video. Sauron from Rings of Power. Now, Sauron from the books is a somewhat nuanced character in that he is given the opportunity to come back to the side of the Valar, briefly, before he decides to reject that offer because he wants to become the next Dark Lord. He decides to do this by taking the Soviet approach and slowly subverting the hearts of the free people of Middle-earth via communism. I mean, the Rings of Power. He's cold, calculating, and he's a monster dedicated to the corruption and mastery of all things. He's a master manipulator with a god complex and enough power to back it up to the creatures of Middle-earth. And yet in Rings of Power, he's a Twilight-looking twink with an attitude to match. Simp. The trailer for Rings of Power gives him a wig and a shave and made him wear the muumuus that all the elves wear in this show because nothing is more intimidating than the Dark Lord in drapes. His motivation in the show is not to conquer, but to have Galadriel look at him the same way she looks at the horse the Númenóreans gave her. This trend of neutering villains is not new. Wanda Maximoff in Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness, wants to get her imaginary kids from WandaVision back. Her way of accomplishing this is to travel the multiverse and kidnap them from an alternate version of herself. Still with me? Okay, so firstly, why doesn't she go to an alternate universe where said children, are orphans, and grab them from there? That would make her the hero of this story. And why is she sending space monsters to retrieve the daughter of the space lesbians when she could, I just don't know, ask? Seriously, she's retarded enough to do it if Wanda had just asked, and then we get around to how the villains are treated. Hans Gruber is intimidating, and it's not just that he gives Mr. Miyagi a 45 facial, it's also that Alan Rickman possesses a presence that Elizabeth Olsen simply lacks. Not that the script helped at all with the jokes inserted every 5 seconds, but she is not treated as a villain in the same way. Doctor Strange straight up tells her that he doesn't care about her torturing an entire town full of innocent people. She's treated as a tragic heroine, for some reason, instead of the frickin' psycho that she is. Memo to Marvel. If you cannot make your villain a credible threat to the protagonist, take them back to the drawing board until they are. A great example of this absolute dim-wittery is Kang, who is incapable of being a credible threat to anyone because the writers undermined every action he took to the point that he goes from character to MacGuffin at nearly every single occasion. If he's not undermined by cringy Le Cordier humor, it's his own idiocy, and if that fails, the writer will come in with a deus ex machina to pound home just how little he actually matters as a character. And yet the writers follow the trend from WandaVision and try to make him tragic halfway villain midway through the story who consistently fails to commit to the bit. The problem is that half the time the writers have a strange sympathy for the villains of their projects while they make the heroes of the story the bad guys. For an example of this, see Star Wars The Acolyte. Now, the Jedi are not actually the villains in that story, but the characters and the writers treat them as such because breaking the binary of good and evil for just making everyone a bunch of assholes clamoring for powers always works out so well. This is not reserved for cape crap or the copious quantities of recent Disney war projects. It's becoming a real heckin' problem, not just because these are cavemen attempting to paint the Sistine Chapel in mammoth shit, but because they are doing it everywhere, and doing so horribly. But tell me what you think down below. This has been Pete, the Radical Nerd, signing off.